abandoned me at Michigan, and of course, then I had to follow her. I think I was thinking about this listening to the other talks this morning, and this area of online algorithms, this is an area that we need. We have a lot to offer in online learning. Enormous amount, because we live in this world of bias versus variance trade-off. And in the online setting, bias versus variance is the game. It's always the game. And that's underlying everything I'm going to say today. So I just press this out. Uh-oh. It doesn't. Oh. Okay. Maybe I go backwards. How about going backwards? It worked. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus. There's really interesting work in the digital space on the use of sensors to do phenotyping, to detect risk. I won't speak about that here. I'm going to talk more about closing the loop. And so in the digital interventions in the healthcare arena, this is about wraparound care or ancillary care. So someone is already coming in at regular intervals to the clinic. How do you provide support outside of the clinic? And it's almost always some sort of behavioral care, like adherence to medications, or managing your stress, or helping you be more physically active, and so on. And all these interventions tend to have multiple components. And I'm going to show you some examples of how they have multiple intervention components. And almost every component involves sequential decision making. And the number of decisions per individual over time can be into the thousands. I mean, many, many decisions for each person over time. How are these decisions being made? One way, a variety of online algorithms are used to make these decisions. One type of algorithm that is being used is the reinforcement learning algorithms. There's other types of algorithms just trying to spread out interventions across the day, across risk times. These are also online algorithm problems. I wanted to mention, and you've already seen this today or yesterday as well, there's a lot of non-health areas, online education, enormous interest in using online algorithms in online education. Online ad placement, I mean, this is where you see it all the time. Every time you go to Google, Facebook, people are running different kinds of algorithms on you. Optimization algorithms, large language modeling RL is being used. As supply chain optimization, Amazon uses RL in supply chain optimization. If I get a chance, I'll speak. It's a little different from, we're really lucky in the setting we're here, that in the digital intervention, we have the opportunity to use the algorithm online. Whereas if you go to supply chain optimization, it's sim to real life. They run the algorithm in a simulation type environment. They find a policy, they implement the policy, and then they run the algorithm again in another simulation environment. Here we're talking about online. So we have a unique opportunity here. It's much more online. So the data is classical data in this setting, SAR, state action reward, and I just enumerated what these are. State is different types of sensor data, data from your phone, data from other types of wearables like chest bands, the little earbud thing you were talking about. The action is some sort of nudge or behavioral support that's provided, and that's what, here I just call it an action, and it's the algorithm's decision as to what that action is. I'll show you an example later. And then there's a reward, and this is the algorithm's reward. The algorithm's reward is somewhat related to the health outcome you're looking for, but it's not always, it's not one-to-one. the algorithm, so we're talking about online RL. So here, the algorithm is attempting to learn. It has a certain amount of time. It doesn't know that it's an anytime algorithm. It doesn't know T, capital T, ahead of time, but it's trying. The goal is the algorithm should maximize some sum of rewards. So here's an example. This study actually just went into the field in November. It has two components, which is sort of unusual. That's very few for this setting. The self-monitoring and the engagement component. It involves this is a collaboration with Procter & Gamble. We're using their toothbrush. And the engagement component is try to help the person engage, have a positive view of the app so that they'll self-monitor their toothbrushing. And you can see the little engagement going across. There's a whole bunch of different types of engagements. These are your actions. The decision times 2 times per day. And the state data comes from the electronic toothbrush. How much the person is actually working on learning how to brush their teeth appropriately. So I wanted to be really clear. There's ways to think about RL which helps you really understand the problem, and it's actually not that complicated. And so in online RL, there's 2 elements. There's always usually 2 elements. The first element is what we understand is a learning algorithm. It's often incrementally implemented, but in my world, it's just statistical. It's some sort of statistical fitting model. It's fitting some sort of multivariate distribution, and it inputs the data you have, say, right up to time t, and it outputs some statistical inference for use at time t. Again, it may be incrementally, often it is incrementally implemented. And then the other element, the second element, is the optimization algorithm. So this is a method for selecting those actions at each time. This method inputs the current state, the data that's available at that time. It inputs the information provided by the learning algorithm. It combines these 2 sources of information and outputs an action. And the learning algorithm has to make some, and people in RL know this, it has to make some difficult decisions. Does it choose an action which helps the optimization algorithm? Does it choose an action which helps the learning algorithm do a better job of inference? Or does it choose an action which says, oh, this learning algorithm is doing great, I have a good idea of what action to use? That's called exploitation. So the second element of the RL algorithm is always trying to balance either helping the learning algorithm do a better job or trying to exploit the knowledge provided by the learning algorithm. So it's not even that sophisticated. It's just simple. Okay. Oh, great. So there's growing realization that when in the use of RL for real life, that it's actually a more complex setting. So, and here's my little picture to show this. So you always have a sequence of implementations. And this is going on both in companies as well as online education and so on. So at each implementation, you can imagine here, in my case, there would be N1 people, and you're choosing, you have some little artificial agent, that's the RL agent. It's choosing actions over time for those N1 people. And then that goes on for a particular amount of time, T1. Then there's a human in the loop. And the human, why is there a human in the loop? It's because this is a setting where the technology is evolving very rapidly. So a new sensor comes out, and you want to use that sensor. All of a sudden, you have different amounts of information you could use. The population is changing. You may go from sedentary people to people with stage 1 hypertension. The pandemic, in our case, occurs. So you have societal changes. All of this comes up with this human in the loop. And so there's a whole sequence, and it's the minute you get into the real life setting, you know a lot of the theory behind RL doesn't make a lot of sense anymore because you're not trying to just learn in one implementation and then you're done. It's just not like that. Let me see, I wanted to make sure I said, okay, I'll just leave it like this. This is the setup in general for RL in real life. As you're going, so I'm going to talk to you about another study, Heart Steps. It's going to come very soon, and we're about ready to go into our 5th implementation, and this is the standard. So these are continual learning settings, and this is the area that RL in real life is moving towards. And in general, it's a continual learning type setting. Here, the upper level involves the human in the loop. That's what I showed you on the last slide. And the lower level can use an artificial agent, an RL agent, that attempts to learn during the implementation, that immediate loop implementation. So in this setting, the minute you think of it in continual learning, the RL agent is itself part of the treatment now. It's not an experimental design. Its goal is to be, so like in rollout, even in rollout, say like by Kaiser in Seattle, you would have a series of implementations. There's a human in the loop. Society is changing. You have new sensors. You have new wearables. You've always got to think continual learning. So the RL agent is part of the intervention now. So here's Heart Steps. I didn't mention V1. V1 was a setting in which the actions were chosen according to a pre-specified behavior, what's called a behavior policy. In certain states, you could choose a variety of actions. In other states, you could only choose one action. That's the way V1 was set up. And then there was learning between V1 and V2, between V2 and V3, and up to V4. And all of these, the population changed, went from sedentary people to people with stage 1 hypertension in V2 and V3. This was at Kaiser in Seattle. V4 was in Southern California with overweight people. Each time you have slight changes. At this moment, there's 5 components that involve sequential decisions, and 2 of the components are using online algorithms. I'm just going to talk, if you've heard me talk about Heart Steps before, this is the component I usually talk to computer scientists and statisticians. This is a setting where there's 5 decisions per day. There's the action space is only binary. Send one of these contextually tailored activity suggestions. The activity suggestion is tailored to the weather at that time, the time of day, where you are at that time, and so on. And the algorithm gets the reward of a subsequent 30-minute step count because the activity suggestion is intended to help the person be more active at that moment. The primary reason why I brought this is to emphasize this nature of implementation, learning by humans, implementation, learning by humans as you go through. So in this case, it was the RL algorithm and V2 and from V2, V3, and V4 it was identical. Other components of the intervention were enhanced. And so this is the RL algorithm that was run in V2, V3, and V4. We're going into V5, and the RL algorithm will be totally rebuilt. So what it did was it used a Bayesian linear regression for the reward function, that is the mean of the reward given current state and action. That was the learning algorithm. And then the optimization algorithm used posterior sampling. So this looks like it's a Thompson sampling, classical Thompson sampling algorithm, but it's not really. Because this, so let me just talk to you about posterior sampling so that we're all on the same page, just to make sure we're together. So what happens is the optimization algorithm uses the inference from the Bayesian linear regression to calculate a probability about the posterior distribution. And this was the posterior distribution that the advantage of sending a suggestion in state S minus the advantage of not sending a suggestion is greater than a particular threshold. It calculated that probability, and that probability was used to determine whether to send a suggestion. This threshold, if you're familiar with Markov decision processes, it came from a Markov decision process that was built on V1. So each implementation, they lead from one to the next. They set you up for the next implementation. So I wanted to talk about open problems here. So the current setup is it has this little, there's my former slide at the very top of the right. So a lot of the current research is what that human in the loop might be doing, okay? So there's work in if you're going to run an implementation, a clinical trial using an RL algorithm, how can you determine how many users you want? How do you do primary analyses? What are the primary estimands? All of this is relatively primitive, but it's being used by a large number of studies. So a lot of work could be done to improve this. Okay, it's all very primitive, but at least it's there. And then the second bullet point is, at least the beginnings are there. The second bullet point comes on, again, it's about that human that's between the implementation. And classically, the idea here was each implementation would be on a almost the same population. So the idea was in each implementation, you take that data and you attempt to learn an optimal policy from that batch data. The implementations depended. Some of the implementations have actions following a known exploration policy, which is the case, say, with V1. Hartsip's V1. This is often, I've seen this with electronic medical record data. You're attempting to use observational data. You have so it's not really an implementation. You just have a batch of data, and now you're going to the future. And then more recently, data that has been collected using a reinforcement learning algorithm in the prior implementation. So there is work. There's work out there. It's enormous amount has been done by people in business schools because of the ad placement problem. There's still a lot to be done, but there's work in all of these areas, okay? It's not like it's totally new. One thing, though, I think that's going to be very exciting going towards the future is how do you warm start the next implementation, the transfer problem. People have mentioned the transfer problem repeatedly, and here the transfer problem can involve small changes in all of these. None of these changes are expected to drastically change the responsivity of the individuals, but you do have to be concerned about that transfer. One of the issues here is how do you use population level data on a wellness population to warm start the algorithm for a clinical population. This is really an interesting area. It's, as far as I can tell, it's pretty much completely open, this area. There's just not much there. Another area which I think is very interesting, I don't work in this area at all, but I strongly feel that we need more work in this area, is often the team that's involved, the whole health science team that's involved in these multiple implementations, they want to do mechanistic research. You know, they want to understand, they want to explore the causal chain. And how do you think about the structural DAG with the a mediation model? How do you do that when your data was collected with an RL algorithm? It's really interesting. Some careful thought has to be given to this. So that's another area that's very open here. The whole issue of trading bias and variance, that's our expertise. You know, we're the guys. I mean, we're the people that do that. This is how we think all the time about trading bias and variance. How do we use working assumptions on the multivariate distribution, like this time-varying directed acyclic graph that evolves over time? How do we use working assumptions on that to speed up learning? Hartsip's V5, we're going to be trying to do this. Whether we succeed is a different issue, but the whole game is to speed up learning. What does it mean to speed up learning? It means reducing variance and paying the price with a little bias. Essentially, that's what we're talking about. This second bullet point, I think, is I find it very subtle, and I just want to make some statements. So for the longest time, everybody in the current implementation, they said, oh, well, if you're going to do theory, you have to develop an algorithm which does regret minimization. That is, maximize the rewards in that implementation. The minute you realize you're in a continual learning setup, this is completely bogus. Because the implicit assumption when you want to do regret minimization is that you're in a stationary world, you're going to learn the policy and just deploy it from then on. That's not the game. We need to regret doing regret minimization. Theory for continual learning is desperately needed here. How do you think about what you should be optimizing? And it's a tracking problem. We have to think more, what do we mean by, what do you optimize in a tracking problem where you have sequential decisions? I really think the field, we've got to make progress. It's really important. So going to this trading bias with variance, this is a disaster. I mean, it's a constant pressure on me to trade bias versus variance because we're trying to learn online. These are online algorithms. Okay, so let's go to Oralytics. As I said, this is a collaboration with Procter & Gamble, and it involves all these engagement components. So here it was pretty clear that we needed to trade bias versus variance. The study only lasts 70 days. You only have 2 decision points per day. You're not going to be able to learn individually on a person. So what were our first efforts at trading bias versus variance? I think that's on the next slide. So first of all, our prior, we're using a Bayesian method. The prior is informative. In my world, the prior is always informative. Right. I'm totally into informative priors. Yeah, well, pretty informative, yeah. The action space, it turns out, is much larger than 2-dimensional in the Oralytics, okay? I think it's 6-dimensional. But what we end up doing, because the signal is so low compared to the noise when you're experimenting in real life, what we compare is any kind of nudge versus nothing at all. So the algorithm is only going to be forced on, do we bother that person or do we not bother that person? We'll do after study inference with humans will be used to discriminate between the different types of actions. We're using Thompson sampling with an engineered reward. So the reward was engineered in a sim to real life setup. I can speak about that. This is a setting, because you're going into the field, you're going to be running an online algorithm. This is not the simulation environment you build. It's not like a simulation environment you build for JASA or the Annals or something. These simulation environments are built off of real data where you're trying to anticipate all the problems that might occur, and you're trying to find an algorithm that lives on a Pareto boundary of. Okay, so one thing we learned in these intensive simulations we did prior to implementing Oralytics in the field was we learned that even though the individuals in our existing data from the same sensor suite exhibited incredible heterogeneity, it was better to have an RL algorithm that pretended like they were all the same and pooled their data. Talk about bias versus variance trade-off here, right? So the noise is so high, it's worth incurring the bias due to the fact that the people are quite heterogeneous. You get better sums of rewards, or better, in the sim environment, we got better brushing behavior over the duration of the study by acting as if everyone was similar, even though they're not. Okay, so I want to talk to you, because here's a place where statistics really came and saved us. Okay, I just want to, first of all, thinking about the problem as a statistician was useful, but second of all, statistics had to save us, and I'm going to tell you why. We're already funded to do 2 implementations in this study, and actually we just got funding to do a 3rd implementation on a slightly different population, but I didn't know that at that time. I just knew we were going to have 2 at this time. Okay, so all of a sudden, here we are in implementation 1. We're going to trade bias and variance and pool, the RL algorithm is going to pool across every one. This is a disaster for that little human. You see him? Oh, no. It's a disaster. Why is it a disaster? It's a disaster. Statistician comes to the rescue. The theoretical statistician. Okay, so let's just think about this, how the theoretical statistician came to the rescue. Okay, so here you have your patients. I made it simplified. The problem's been simplified for me to explain things. So just think of the patients as rows. This is at time 1. You get the state, the algorithm gets the state of each patient. It randomly chooses the first action, say with probability 1/2. And then it observes, it inputs the rewards. In this case, it's brushing quality, a measure of brushing quality. So the algorithm pools all their data together, and it produces a posterior sampling probability with these, it's an engineered reward. It takes that, this is just one posterior policy, one posterior sampling policy. And now at time 2, it looks at the state of each of your people. It applies that one policy to each person, inputs their state, and outputs whether or not, what action to choose, whether or not to nudge them or not in this particular setting. It redoes it. It updates the posterior distribution. It again produces one sampling policy. What have we done? We've taken independent participants, we've applied RL, and we've output dependent participants. Dependent in a very peculiar way. They're not dependent in the sense that people knew each other or they had the same physician. No, this is not, it's not that kind of dependence. The dependence is only through the algorithm. So the actions for one person is informed by the responsivity of another person at the prior time point. What are you going to, so now you have dependence. We know from survey, we have classical statistical training. We went through statistics. We know from survey sampling that you have to adjust you have to get a design effect. You have to adjust your standard errors because you've produced this weird dependence. And so, in effect, even though you think you have a certain level of information, you have less information than you think because of the dependence. You don't have independent units. Theory to the rescue. This is great. This is here. We had to until we. It was great. Kelly did a great job, the PhD student who developed the method. But until that method got developed, we could not run that trial. That method had to get developed so we could justify the sample size, so we could register the trial in clinicaltrials.gov. As you all know, that's what you do in our world. So we had to develop a method to adjust the standard errors. And it was totally cool. It used some cool blah, 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 mathy, and change of measures, uniform central limit theorem, whatever. But it was, yeah. And now, MyWaves, we have a study that's going into the field. We're going to use a much more sophisticated approach to pooling data that looks at measures of similarity between participants and pools only to the extent of that similarity. But we're able to do it because of her work. So I have just a few more slides. These are the emerging challenges. So big issues that we're really struggling with. We're going to really struggle with the first 2 bullets in Hartstepp's V5. We have a distal health outcome we want to achieve, and the rewards that we can achieve in the meantime, they're expensive to collect. They impose burden on the individuals. How do you develop an algorithm in this setting? I can't tell you how to do it. I just say you need to figure it out. This has to be done. Can we use causal DAGs, mediational models, to improve the learning of the algorithm? Can we do this in a robust way so that we don't have a disaster at the end of the day? This is all, I think these are really big questions. And how does bias versus variance trade-off enter here? Maybe we can incur some causal bias if we get better outcomes. It's not, yeah. This first bullet point is something that's really been bothering me for quite some time. I think going forward in the digital intervention space, almost all of our states are going to be predictions. Predictions of the person's current stress level. Predictions of whether or not they're engaged in the app. Predictions of whether or not they're going to recharge their wearable, and so on. Predictions have a lot of, we've heard this today, the last 2 days, and these are all black box machine learning predictions. We have to have measures of confidence. Why? The measure of, if we don't have a lot of confidence, that may influence what action we even choose. Some actions will only be suitable if the confidence in the prediction is high. Think suicide ideation. This is a perfect one. If the confidence in your prediction of suicide ideation in the next 4 hours is low, that's going to change the kind of action you'll provide. Another one that's, we've just gotten into this area, I strongly believe is very open. This computer scientists, as best I can tell, haven't gone there in either one of these, okay? I mean, it's pretty open for us because we have the right background. How do you conduct post-mortem analyses? So with hard steps, I have all these beautiful graphs, and it makes it look like the algorithm has learned an enormous amount about the individual and is personalizing the nudge. Yeah, right. Do you believe this? The algorithm itself, it's posterior sampling. It's stochastic. We know that you can get beautiful results just due to stochasticity. How do you do post-mortem analyses which look at the performance of that algorithm and say, oh, what you want to do is you want to truth in advertising. And the reason why this came about was I had these great graphs. I thought, okay, we're going to put them in the next grant. Because if I put these graphs that show beautiful personalization in the next grant, I'll definitely get funded because, I have to get funded. And all of a sudden, are they real? Is this just totally spurious? We really got to think about this carefully. We have some first ideas, extremely primitive ideas. Actually, everything I do is very primitive. I don't do anything sophisticated. I do shallow learning, not deep learning. Okay. These are big teams, tons of software engineers, tons of people, oral surgeons here, human-computer interaction people are on these. There's a lot of computer scientists, statisticians, behavioral scientists. We all have to work together. Thanks.
Any questions?
Many thanks, Susan, for your excellent talk. And I cannot agree more with many of the points that you mentioned during your talk, especially on non-stationarity, on like mediation, on like sparse rewards. So because that's also something that I encounter in my research as well. So I just want to elaborate on the point of weak signal. So I think weak signal is not only like frequently encountered in health studies, but it is also encountered in many other like real applications as well. So for instance, I also work on like ride sharing, And to my knowledge, like in these settings, the signal is also very weak. So I just wonder, like, have you measured like how much improvement that your estimated optimal policy does, like compared to like a standard baseline?
Yeah, so that's a lot of the post-mortem analysis is related to this. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. The post-mortem analysis does a lot of that. So for these people, did the algorithm really help? For this subgroup, we're using resampling methods to examine whether or not the algorithm was really worthwhile for a particular person or a particular subset of people. Now, in oralytics, we're going to be under the gun. The second implementation, there will be a 2-arm randomized trial, and we're going to be 1 arm. Now, we haven't figured out what the other arm will be. There's a lot of pressure to make the other arm pretty sophisticated. So we're going to be under a lot of pressure to see if the RL can really pay off in a marginal sense, because that's what a 2-arm does, right? It's marginal. The post-mortem analysis is more looking at resampling early indications that there may be a subgroup or different types of people that might benefit more versus less. The low signal is exactly the reason why our community is needed in this area. If the signal were high, you don't need it. You can be back into robotics, you can do games. It's not our game anymore. But the fact that it's a low signal means this is our game. It's the bias versus variance game. It's how can you bring in domain knowledge in a way which it doesn't ruin things. You'll get a little bias, but you'll increase the learning speed and you get better performance. So the very fact it's a low signal means it's our game. Yeah.
One more question.
Yeah, thanks for the nice talk. So my question related to the previous question, but more on your Bayesian linear regression model for your reward function that you mentioned you use informative prior. So I'm just wondering, how did you specify informative prior using domain knowledge?
Notice that we have a sequence of implementations. So each implementation is used to rebuild the prior. The first implementation, so in all of our studies, the first implementation, the pre-existing data we have is impoverished in some way. It depends on the setting. Like in Heart Steps, the pre-existing data had the same sensor suite, and it was a pure exploration policy. It was great. Same actions, it was fantastic, but a slightly different population. And so we built the prior based on the prior implementation. In oralytics, we were fortunate enough to have data from the same population with the same sensor suite, but no actions. So that sim to real life, it's used to build the prior as well. So we both use, so there's usually, in oralytics, I think we had 10 variants of the simulation environment, and we would build the prior based on one variant and then test it in the other environments. You know, so it's like almost like a CV kind of game. Yeah.
Thanks. Also, have you tried like using like a?
For the interest of time,
Sorry.